Well, welcome to question 105 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is disobedience, and I am Dr. Thibault. When we're looking at disobedience, we have to properly place it. It is under the cardinal virtue of justice. Under the potential parts of justice is the virtue of observance, and one of the vices which is contrary to observance is disobedience. That's where we are today. So there's only two articles within this section, so it makes it rather brief. So disobedience, the first question is it a mortal sin? Now, if you recall, anything that's dealing with justice is dealing with giving one's due. So that frames it all. Disobedience, a violation of giving one's proper due. Um, well, mortal sin is one of contrary to charity, something which is not unique to this question. This is always the definition of mortal sin, one which is contrary to charity. And by charity, we love God and our neighbor. So that's the basis of it. So if disobedience is a mortal sin, it must be contrary to the love of God and neighbor. So is it? So therefore, to be disobedient to the commandments of God is a mortal sin because it is contrary to the love of God. How? Because the commandment of God contains the precepts of obedience to superiors. So because God has commanded the obedience of people to the superiors as part of natural law and divine law, and we are called to be obedient to God. Therefore, disobedience to our superiors is disobedience to God. Therefore, it lacks charity. Well, yes. So therefore, it's a mortal sin. It is, as St. Thomas kind of points out here, it's quite seriously a mortal sin fairly often. However, there is some exceptions, obviously. So it can also be venial. So if your your superior were to ask you to do something, and through your laziness or your forgetfulness, you don't do it, you did not intentionally be disobedient, right? You did not refuse uh, to listen to your superior. You simply have forgotten. Uh, well, the forgottenness, disobedience in that regard would be a venial sin because it didn't have the intentionality of being disobedient. Now, if you intend to be disobedient, then it becomes a mortal sin. But if you really, through, through some other fault, don't do it, it's because it might be a venial sin. Um, One of the objections, the first objection, I think is extremely strong and related. I don't usually put the objections right in there, but I think it's an extremely strong argument. These are one of St. Thomas's, instead of a straw man argument that he fights, he sets up an Iron Man argument that he fights, and that is, if every sin is disobedience, therefore wouldn't every sin be mortal, right? If every sin is if every sin is somewhat a disobedience to the divine law, natural law, then wouldn't every sin be mortal? And we don't call every sin mortal, therefore it cannot be true. And St. Thomas responds in his response to objection one, materially, everybody who disobeys um, everyone who disobeys a commandment is materially disobedient, right? The act of disobedience. So if a person ever steals or lies or commits any sin against one of the um, ordinances of God, that they are materially disobedient, but not necessarily formally, right? So if the intention is not to be disobedient, then not every sin is formally disobedient. And uh, an example of this is, as St. Thomas points out in the second objection, second article is the sin of Adam and Eve. Right? Isn't the original sin of man uh, disobedience? Right? Do not eat from the tree, the wisdom of good and knowledge, good and evil, and they eat from the tree. Therefore, isn't the first sin disobedience? Therefore, isn't that perhaps one of the worst sins? Disobedience. St. Thomas responds that the sin of Adam and Eve was not directed at disobedience, but of pride. Right? The sin of Adam and Eve wasn't to intentionally try to be disobedient to God. They weren't intentionally doing that. What they wanted was to be like gods. Right? If we eat of this tree, we will be like gods. Um, that's pride. So their sin was materially disobedience. Formally, it was pride, right? It was the final end that they were aiming at was not disobedience, but they were aiming at uh, some degree of pride. So, in that regards, we have to look at the specific acts. We can't just look at the material effects because many sins have similar material effects, which is negative reaction, negative consequences. We don't look at the negative consequences. We look at the formal cause of the actions. Now, disobedience article 2, again, only 2 articles. Contempt, contempt of the commander, well, is disobedience the worst sin, the most grievous sin? And the answer is pretty obviously no. If it's not always even a mortal sin, it can't always be the worst sin. Now, if a person, as St. Thomas points out, has contempt for one's commander, it is more grievous than contempt for his commands. And the example that he gives of this is, if you hate somebody, you are a murderer, right? If you hate God, you become a blasphemer. If you just simply don't follow the commands of somebody, it doesn't make you a murderer. If you simply don't follow the commands of God, it doesn't make you a blasphemer necessarily, right? It's sins against the person is worse than sins of nonconformity with their will, right? That there is a difference between that. Now, not every disobedience is equally a sin, right? And this is ties in with the last question a little bit, where um, depends on St. Thomas says 2 factors. One is the level of the superior making the command. So, I guess we think about this in very real life situations. If you are working at a fast food restaurant and your shift supervisor asks you to do something, it's you're still bound to do it, but it isn't as bad as if the store manager directly asks you to do something, or if the district manager specifically asks you to do something, or the owner of the store asks you to do something. The CEO of the corporation, right? If the CEO of McDonald's comes in and asks you, "Can you show me this program?" and you say no, that disobedience to the CEO of the corporation is going to be much more serious than if your shift supervisor asked you to wash the floor and you say no. The degree of insult is different depending on the level of the superior. Now, neither one of them is good. Both of them are disobedient, but one is to a worse degree than another, right? And if a person were to the shift supervisor asked you to wash the floor and then you got busy and you didn't get around to it, then it wasn't even intended, right? It would be accidental versus the first example of the CEO asking you to run a program on the computer and you said no, right? That has the intention of disobedience and to a high ranking person. So that's to that degree. The degree matters. Also, the degree to which the thing is commanded, the part in which it's commanded. So if you were um, hosting the CEO at your store and they asked you to help them run a program as an example for other employees, and they're live streaming it and all these people are watching it. A lot of people are giving their time and energy to learn this thing, and the CEO has asked you to help. This is to a high level of importance. It's a very important thing. If they ask you to um, sweep up the floor, at the end of the night, that is to a lesser degree of importance. Not that it's not important, but maybe the people in the morning could also do it before the store opens, or Taco Bell might be open all night long, so somebody else in the next shift could get it. Not to say that it's not important, but there are degrees in which something is commanded. So I'm speaking in very earthly terms, but these can be uh, applied in higher degrees, right? If the bishop has specifically asked you to do something of importance, and you don't do it, it's worse than if your parish priest specifically asked you to do something and you didn't do it. And if the thing is very important, the more important the obedience would be. So, it's just very practically looking at degrees, right? Depends on the degree of the thing asked and the degree of the person who asked you. I can also see that with this can also be some level of bystander apathy, right? If the president of the United States gets on TV and asks all Americans to do something, it doesn't seem as binding as if you were standing in the room with the president and the president were to ask you specifically to do something. Right? A person can be very high ranking. Pope Francis could make a very high ranking statement. But when you say it to 1 billion Catholics, it doesn't seem as um, connected to me personally. Right? Maybe recommends a day of fasting for world peace. If I forget, it doesn't seem to be as important as if I met with him and he asked me to do something very specifically. Um, so there's definitely levels of degrees. Now, God's will is essentially directed uh, at the good, and the greater the good, the more does God wish it to be fulfilled. Therefore, in a similar way, we're talking about our superiors. This is true, but it's more true even of God. If God, the greater the good, the more binding it is. The greater the good, the less disobedience should be tolerated. So I didn't do the conclusion, but in essence, there's only two slides. It's easy to go back and forth. Disobedience um, uh, is sometimes a mortal sin. Typically, it's a mortal sin if you intend to be disobedient. If the formal cause is disobedience, then it would be a mortal sin. If it is simply forgetfulness or something else, it might be a venial sin, right? If that's not the intention, but there's still a level of sin connected with disobedience because it's part of the proper order and it's giving to each one their due. So if a superior is due something, and that is obedience. And if you are disobedient, you are not giving that superior that which is due. Um, and and the degree of the sin associated with disobedience depends on the level of the person who's superior and the thing commanded, and the more closer it is to the good is also relevant. So that's all we have here on this very short section.